Hey guys, it's Gary. I'm back December 30th, I think it is. This probably won't be a short one today, unfortunately. My New Year's resolution, make shorter videos. But I'm playing music and it might be too loud. Did a video about 6 days or so ago. It might have even been Christmas Eve, I'm not sure. I was sick as a dog. Christmas Eve, naturally couldn't get a doctor's appointment. I had either pretty serious bronchitis or possibly walking pneumonia even, I don't know. Couldn't get a doctor's appointment naturally. Went to urgent care, and let me tell you, it's amazing that urgent care wasn't around years ago. I don't know who thought of it, but they should have thought of it a long time ago, and I've never had to use their services prior. But Christmas Eve, and then Christmas Day, and then the weekend falling would be 5 days before I could get a doctor's appointment. And I was coughing my brains out, my chest hurts, my lungs hurt, and I was weak to boot, and that's the thing that scared me. So I barely had enough energy to get into the car to get to urgent care, where I didn't know where it was. Thankfully, it was all 5 minutes away. Thankfully, GPS told me how to get there. So I did a round of antibiotics for 5 days, and that was 6 days ago now. And I feel a lot better. I still have a cough. My chest and lungs still hurt a bit, but I'm 1,000 times better than what I was. And first time ever I missed Christmas with any relatives. I usually see my sister. Did not see her for Christmas Day. I was home alone Christmas Day and the day after. Finally on Sunday, was able to get to my sister's house. I felt better. And it was kind of anticlimactic. I mean, they had presents for me, I had presents for them, but all their other stuff was already opened. And it was kind of like, I missed out on the enjoyment of watching them open the presents they got for each other. It kind of initially felt like Christmas to me until I got there and everything was open already. So it was kind of a downer. It's the first time it ever happened to me. I thought today, it's been a bit it's been a while since I did a video, a few days anyway. I'd like to get a couple actually live videos in a week if I can. I thought what I would do today is actually show the stuff that I got for Christmas. I didn't want to just show it though. I wanted to listen to it so I could do some commentary on it as well. So I've been absorbing this stuff now for 3 days or so. Been playing pretty much my Christmas stuff. These are all things I asked for that I put on my list anyway, which is the way we work with my family, because they would have no idea what to get for me. But I have no idea what selections they're actually going to make out of the big list that I make. So I'll try to. I have some commentary on some of these, so I'll try to go fast. Buddy Rich, The Solos. This is an interesting album. It's weird. I had mentioned this in a prior video. Last time I was unemployed, which was around 1982 or 83. For some reason, I got into a Buddy Rich mode. I had never been in there before. I'm not a huge big band fan. Something made me pick up some albums by him, and during that unemployment period, I was all of a sudden interested for some reason. And those were a lot of late 60s, early to mid 70s recordings, which is the period I'm most interested of his work. And oddly enough, once I started work again, back around late 83, 84, I really didn't listen much to Buddy Rich. And all the intervening years until last January or February or so, I had only bought one single Buddy Rich CD. And I think that was because I got it really cheap. And I picked it up, and I must have listened to it at the time, but had very little recollection of it. So I lose my job, and ended last March. And after being unemployed for a while, something made me pull out those old albums of Buddy Rich's. and I started liking them, and I started buying them when I get them cheaply on CD, because these are all old vinyl things. And all of a sudden, weird, here I am unemployed again after 32 years or something, and all of a sudden I'm in Buddy Rich mode again. So unemployment must have something to do with me being fascinated with Buddy Rich. And I found a bunch of albums of his, mainly from the 70s. I bought one of the compact jazz compilations, though, as well, of Buddy Rich, and that was mostly 50s stuff, 1950s era stuff. But most of the stuff I was interested in was pretty much from my high school years, when he was doing a little more, I wouldn't say jazz rock, but there was some like electric guitar in his band and stuff like that. And I got, all of a sudden, here I am unemployed again, and I'm back into this Buddy Rich mode. And I had a bunch of, I got a bunch of CDs when I could get them cheaply of his, and also have a whole bunch more on my wish list, and put a bunch on my wish list for Christmas presents. And this one's kind of interesting. This is actually a more recent one. It came out 2014. And it is pretty much what it says. These were all taken from live gigs in 1976 and 1977, also my high school years, but previously unreleased stuff, but only drum solos. So it's an album of about 66 minutes of drum solos. There's nine drum solos on here. So you have to be obviously a drum solo fanatic. Thought it was an interesting concept. What they did is during his concerts, Buddy Rich would have one or two tunes where he would play an extended solo at the end of the track, and then the band would just end, with a sustained chord or something like that. And what they did here was, for these 2 years, they had these live tapes, and they extracted just the solos. So what you hear is the last a couple bars, maybe, as it fades in, of the big band playing whatever tune they're playing, and goes right into the solo within a few seconds. And then usually the band just comes in and just for one more sustained chord at the end, and it's over. And there's 9 of those. Kind of interesting. You got to be a fan of drum solos, and you have to be in the mood for it. And I did listen to it. I wasn't really in the mood, to listen to it at the time I listened to it. I did it because I wanted to play everything I got and report on it. But he's a good, obviously a good drummer. You have to, have a real stomach for 66 minutes of drum solos, which I have. But it's something that I would revisit more when I'm really specifically in the mood for it. And I was listening to it more because I just recently acquired it, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it for this video. But it's definitely something that I'll be revisiting more when I'm more in the mood to hear 66 minutes of drum solos. On another note, right by my head, man, I haven't got this. You see those records right there, right next to that glowing orb there? That on my shelf are the very few vinyl albums I have, of things that have never come out on CD. And oddly enough, in the last few months, I've pulled off a few things, actually. Several of those albums up there have finally come out on CD, interestingly. I don't pull them off the shelf until I acquire the CD for myself. That's just a thing of mine, but I did get one, and I talked about this. Billy Cobham, another drummer, 1979 solo album called BC. This had never been released on compact disc, and I was surprised that it got released, and I'll tell you why. It's essentially an attempt to make a disco album, and yet still retain a jazz rock flavor. It's not really, doesn't really work. Most people that are Billy Cobham fans, and you know what? The vinyl's not up on the shelf, so I don't know what I did with it. But that's a facsimile of the back cover of the original vinyl, and this is the front cover. Most people would hate this album. I thought it sucked at first when I got it, and I bought it new, sealed for 99 cents. It has one of the worst songs I've ever heard on it. Not just the worst song on a Billy Cobham album, but one of the worst songs I've ever heard in my life. There's a couple vocal songs on here trying to reach a crossover audience. It's none of the jazz rock that has been associated prior, certainly in the 70s, with Billy Cobham's music. There's none of that. There's no geez, I don't even think there's guitar solo anywhere on this whole thing. And he's pretty much known for having a guitar, keyboard-oriented band, electric bass, maybe a saxophone player in there. But this BC was essentially, the height of the disco era. Everybody was trying to cross over. And apparently Billy got briefly sidetracked. But it's such an anomaly, such an unusual recording in his catalog. And I'm not a completist of his stuff. And when I first got the album, I listened to it and I was shocked at how commercial it was. And I put it up on the shelf and I didn't listen to it for many years. And I bought it around 81 or 82. The album originally came out in 79. And I saw why they only charged 99 cents for it. It flopped. I put it on the shelf for many years. Something made me pull it down. And I think it was one of those things like a bit like watching Plan 9 from Outer Space or something. It's like it was almost laughably bad at moments, I thought. And when I put it on again, I got a little bit of appreciation for some of the tracks. I don't know who arranged the tracks. They have all the musician credits on here. But several of the tracks, let's say maybe, I don't know, what is there? There's 8 tracks. At least 4 or 5 of the tracks have, arrangements with horn and string sections. I can't find on the credit who wrote the horn and string sections. And to give you an analogy maybe as to who it sounds like, if you have the Diodato early, something like Prelude, his early couple solo albums that came out here in America, that kind of had a commercial funk, almost disco. This was kind of pre-disco because that was like 72 or 73. But I put it in that category of like the Diodato stuff, heavily arranged, horn charts, string charts, funky popular rhythms at the time. Well, about 4 or 5 of the tracks have that. And it's those the arrangements are actually pretty interesting on those. And recently I pulled out the LP and listened to it again, and actually dumped it into my computer, thinking it would never come out on CD. But it did. And when I was listening to it, I kind of got new appreciation for some of the keyboard solos on there. The arrangements. I just started really listening to arrangements again in the last year or so, really beginning to appreciate like guys like Don Sebesky that have been writing for a lot of people. He wrote a lot of the charts for the CTI records in the 60s and 70s especially. And I never really paid attention to him. I always liked smaller bands, but being a Wes Montgomery fan and owning everything he's pretty much done, I had some of those heavily orchestrated albums, and I began to appreciate the art and the playing and the arrangement itself. And I've been absorbing some of that in the last year or so again. And so when I put the Cobham album on, I noticed that they're not Don Sebesky quality arrangements, but I started appreciating the tracks that had arranging on them. Bobby Lyle plays piano on here. Ernie Watts plays some flute solo stuff. And let me see if there's any other names. Nathaniel Phillips, bass. If you read credits, you might know. Like I said, there's a bunch of vocalists on here, too. There's a lot of female backing vocalists, obviously, there to make singing these little phrases and stuff like that to try to make the thing more commercial, I guess. They do a song, The Lonely Bull, which was, I remember from the 60s from Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. They do kind of an extended version with a lot of arrangement to it in a kind of disco-y mode, like a Diodato disco mode. And let me see, Bobby Lyle, as I mentioned. I don't know, there's really a lot of other people that are named. There's there's some guitar on it, but it's basically a rhythm guitar. And it's got only 8 tracks. It's obvious they were trying to fill time in some of these cases. There's one really awful vocal track which almost gets my nod for the worst song ever written, and which was not written, oddly enough, by Billy, but he could have written it because it shouldn't have taken more than 5 minutes. It's a song called What Is Your Fantasy? And it's a vocal song that basically just has a funk thing throughout the whole thing. It never changes. It just goes bump, 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 bump. What is your fantasy? Bump, 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 bump. Be what you wanna be. Bump, 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 bump. That's the whole song. It just keeps going in that mode. It's, I think, 3 minutes and 35 seconds, and it doesn't change. It just goes pretty much like that for the whole thing. 3:32 according to the time listing on here. Let me tell you something. I can listen to 20-minute drum solos. That is the longest 3.5 minutes on record for me to listen to. Here's an even funnier thing. I was hoping that there'd be some bonus tracks on here when it came out, being only a 40-minute album. There is one bonus track. It is the 12-inch version of What Is Your Fantasy? Now stretched from 3 minutes and 32 seconds, an unbearable 3 minutes and 32 seconds, to 7 minutes and 35 seconds of bump, 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 bump. Okay? Wow, it's really hard to listen to. Absolutely the worst thing on this album, the worst thing on any Cobham album ever, possibly the worst thing ever pressed onto an album. Of course, it was released as a single, because it's a vocal song, and of course it didn't do anything. Even for a commercial song, it's really awful. So there's that. That's definitely a big black X mark on this. There's a track that's just a drum solo, which probably sounded interesting at the time. It's about 7.5 minutes long. And it's a drum solo, and this was 79, early days of drum synthesizers, and somehow there was a studio synthesizer engineer that somehow created a synthesizer, it seems, that responded to what Billy Cobham was playing on drums. So while he's playing this drum solo, it's triggering certain synthesizer effects. It's not an electronic kit that he's using, so I'm not quite sure how it works. And it's about a 7-minute solo. It at the time, it definitely sounded interesting. Not quite as impressive today because of the technology. And the album ends on that. I kind of like that it's there, but you can also tell that it's kind of there to fill time. There's a song called Bring Up the House Lights, which is a 4.5-minute track. That's also a total time waster. Obviously filler. It's nothing but a funk riff. Another funk riff that doesn't change. And while the funk riff is playing, there is a saxophone solo over it. But it's pretty dull. And the weird thing is I don't know if Billy recorded it and afterwards said, wow, this really doesn't go anywhere. And then had the idea, oddly enough, to invite his friend into the studio after the song was all written and recorded and mixed. And he brought in the late George Duke, who doesn't play on the album, but is an associate and a friend at Cobham's. And George Duke and Billy Cobham are just having a conversation in the studio while this song plays back kind of in the background. And they recorded this conversation with these two guys joking around. It wasn't a pre-planned conversation, obviously. They were talking about live gigs that they had played, and Alphonse Mouzon, and they're talking about, and they're joking and chuckling and stuff like that. And obviously, and it was just done to kind of maybe make the track more interesting. And it is, because you know what? The funk rhythm is just so repetitive, it doesn't go anywhere, that you really do find yourself honing in on their conversation that they're having. And it was pretty obvious that George Duke himself had never heard the track prior to their discussing it. And I guess Cobham said, hey, look, I just want you to come. I'm going to play this in the background. We're going to talk and joke around and stuff. Because near the end of the track, George Duke goes, I got a question, man. Billy Cobham goes, what is it? How long is this song anyway? So you can tell even he's getting tired of it. And they laugh. And then it fades out. So it's kind of funny. So, there's, with 5 more tracks that I haven't talked about. Some of them have vocals. Some of the remaining 5 tracks have more of an arrangement, a little bit more of a jazz thing to them. Still kind of, at times, they got the female vocals going on sometimes to make it a little more commercial. Definitely a product of its time, like nothing else he ever recorded. I don't think anybody that really is a fan of Billy Cobham's fusion stuff would like this at all. I don't even think fans of his more acoustic-oriented stuff that he's done in recent years would like it at all either. but it's such a weird album that, you know, when it came out on CD, and I don't really expect it to be in print long, and it just came out this year, I said, you know what, I'm going to get it, because I had been listening to the vinyl that I dumped into my computer. So, you know, it's one of those things that you're drawn to that you don't quite know why, and maybe it's because I have such a long history with it, you know, now, and I bought it in 81 or 82 or so. David Gilmour's new album. I'm not a hardcore Pink Floyd fan. I love reading books on their history, even though many of their albums I don't like at all. This is the deluxe edition of his latest solo album. I played it a couple times. I don't think it's as good as his prior solo album, which came out about 9 years ago. A lot of people like this better because there's maybe a couple more up-tempo tracks on it than his prior album. I thought his prior album was more cohesive as an album, and this just sounds like it's 10 songs, you know, just 10 songs thrown together. Not really thematic, and not in a way that his prior album and a lot of Pink Floyd albums, when you put them on, you want to hear the whole thing and you feel like they're connected. This to me sounds like, you know, it's 10 songs, and I don't get that feeling of, I don't know, continuity or the desire that you really have to listen to the whole thing to pick up on the vibe of the album. A couple nice things about it though. There's a real jazz track on here, you know, totally made up with jazz chord changes and jazzy piano. It's a vocal track, you know, but the real jazz band playing it. Very sophisticated chord changes. Really nice song. And another song that has a jazz section in it, much more jazzy than anything he's done. There's been a ever so slight, on occasion, jazz tinge to some of Gilmour's work, but most of, in Pink Floyd, the jazz element came from Rick Wright, the keyboard player, my favorite member of the band, who died a couple years ago. And Rick Wright was a big jazz fan. And my main love of Pink Floyd was due really to Rick Wright's keyboard playing, which had a jazzy tinge to it. He wasn't a technically brilliant keyboard player, but I loved him. Loved his playing. Because of that jazz element. And one of the tracks, he wrote the music for a few tracks on Dark Side of the Moon, and they tend to be my favorite tracks, and they're the ones with the most sophisticated chord changes, very jazzy chord changes. And one of them, I remember seeing Rick Wright mention that he actually stole the chord sequence from a Miles Davis track, and I'm pretty sure, I'd have to check the Dark Side of the Moon documentary. I'm pretty sure he said it was one of the songs on Miles Davis's Kind of Blue album that he stole the chord sequence for, that he used then, repurposed on one of the Dark Side of the Moon tracks. And my reason really for wanting this as much as I did the deluxe edition of this was, comes with all kinds of, you know, a hard book, 2 hard books in here, studio photos. Comes with a second Blu-ray disc or DVD disc. And one of the things on the disc is these things called barn jams. And back when 2008, Dave Gilmour's prior album was a live album. He released a studio album, I think in 2007, I want to say. 2008, and he went and toured it and released a live album as a result of that in a box set. On that live album, there was a DVD in the deluxe set of that had several sequences of these things called barn jams, recorded in 2007. There was 3 or 4 of them. And what it is where Dave Gilmour lives in England, he's got a big barn a couple hundred years old behind his house. And he's got a music studio set up there. And I'm not sure if there's even heat in there, because you see heaters, these electric heaters all over the place. But there's keyboards, a drum set up there. It's bigger than my whole condo is. And he's, you know, guitars. There's at least 3 keyboards set up there. Really cool place. I could live there. And in 2007, he had Rick Wright, the Pink Floyd keyboard player, come down, and they did these bar jams, you know, and they're just jams from the barn. And they had a bass player who was the guy that's been playing in Pink Floyd since in their live gigs since Roger Waters left in '86 or '87. and a newer drummer that David Gilmour had just started working with. So just a 4-piece. The only thing really preventing it from being called Pink Floyd is that Pink Floyd's drummer, Nick Mason, wasn't there. But apart from that, essentially is Pink Floyd. And Rick Wright and Dave Gilmour were just jamming. They filmed it, and the audio was really good. And they released 3 or 4 of these things called Barn Jams on Dave Gilmour's prior live album set that came out in 2008, which was my reason for buying that, because I just wanted to see Rick Wright. He had passed away actually just as the album was being released. Now, 7-8 years later, the deluxe edition of this comes out, and there's 3 more Barn Jams on here, which is why I wanted to get the deluxe edition. The extra disc has, as well as the making of the album, so you see this particular album, you see them in the studio, and I love that stuff. But my primary reason was to get to see a bit more Rick Wright, because there's 3 more Barn Jams on here. Only amounts to about 16 and a half minutes worth of material, 16, 17 minutes, something like that. But real nice seeing Rick Wright again, and it was very informal because Rick Wright's hair is so messed up. It looks like he was sleeping and he just woke up and came in, and his hair is just all over the place, and it's kind of quaint, And he's playing some synthesizer, but mostly there's organ and electric piano in there, and he's got that jazzy thing going on, which I like of his so much. And that's my reason for really wanting I'll probably end up viewing the DVD, and the making of the album is pretty good as well. But I like those Barn Jams, and who knows, maybe it could be a waste of money. Maybe someday they'll just release the whole Barn Jams, all of them together. I don't know how many there are, but they've only released about 7 so far. And a lot of times it's very predictable stuff. They're jamming, so they're jamming on some fairly simple, in a lot of cases, chord changes. But for me, and with Rick Wright's passing, which got me severely down at the time, it's nice to see him play, and it was very, very much toward the end of his life. This is gonna be a long one, guys. Another thing I asked for that I got, the audiobook. I'm a big fan of audiobooks on CD. Nowadays, they're not making them on CD so much anymore because of the length, I think, and they're kind of sanctioning them off to Audible.com. But Audible.com, when you download their books, they're not in an MP3 or FLAC or WAV file format. So you can't burn them onto a disc and play them in your car. You have to have like it plays on the Audible player, but that's basically then you're stuck on your computer to do it, or smartphone or something. So I still like to buy the books. This is Bill Kreutzmann, one of the founding members of the Grateful Dead. He wrote a book of all his experiences with the Dead in all their years. And eventually, shortly after the book came out, they did the full thing on audiobook. And unfortunately, he doesn't read it, which is the only bad downside to it. He's actually got, oddly, an Australian guy reading it, and Bill Kreutzmann's an American guy, so the accent really doesn't match. But it's interesting. It's 11 CDs on here, 13 hours. What I typically do with these is I dump them into my computer, and I burn them onto a disc, onto an MP3 disc. This is going to take up 2 MP3 discs, but that's okay. It'll take a long time to get through it, certainly in a car. And I'm not a hardcore fan of the Dead. I've got probably more of their solo projects, sampling here and there, than I do their albums. I have a few albums that I like, a couple jazzy albums, a couple more experimental albums, a live album or 2. But I'm very much interested in their cultural thing. The whole time they very much embody the 60s, a time that I'm totally been enamored with my whole life. It was when I was growing up, but I was kind of a bit too young to really understand the scene too much. So I was 10 in '69, and even so, I wasn't all that aware of the stuff. I knew the bands, I knew who they were, but I always kind of thought, specifically Jerry Garcia and Phil Lesh, the Dead's bass player, throughout all their history, founding members, seemed to be very nice guys that you'd love to sit down and talk to, or I would anyway. And they kind of had this cultural thing. They were kind of icons of the 1960s era and the whole period of bands having their own creative control during that period. And so I'm fascinated with the band and the culture around the band. As a result, I actually have probably as many audiobooks about the band as I do, and books, regular physical books, as I do music. Here's a 2 CD set that runs, 2.5 hours or so, called Living with the Dead, that I bought years ago. That was from their manager from, I think, 65 to 85, a guy named Rock Scully, who wrote a book and then did the book on an audiobook, and he read it himself, which kind of adds an extra oomph to it for me. I didn't really know who he was, but he was all through the important years of the band up until the mid-'80s. He was their manager and had a lot of funny stories and sad stories, involving Garcia's drug abuse and stuff like that. And also, probably the best out of them, and also read by the authors, Phil Lesh, the bass player for the Dead, and another original member, something I bought a few years ago. He had written a book of his experiences, and, in the Dead all those years. This came out a few years ago. I'm not finding a date on here. But he read it. This is a 5 CD set, and I want to say it's about 7 hours or so. I still got the shrink wrap on there. It's a little hard to see. My Life with the Grateful Dead. But this is a particularly good one, again, because it's read by the author. So it's a lot about his experiences. He met Jerry Garcia before he met anybody else in the band, and had a friendship with Garcia, and joined the band before they were even called the Grateful Dead. And it goes right up to, I think this came out a number of years ago now, but it was definitely, long after Jerry's passing and everything. Really good book, and again, you get the vibe of the 60s from it, and the Dead, and also, it bears extra weight because, it's read by the guy who wrote it. So I'm looking forward. I really haven't dug into the Bill Kreutzmann thing yet, but, I know he's not reading it, so, it's slightly lesser expectations maybe, but the words are still Kreutzmann's. So I guess that's the important part. A couple things that probably a lot of people would know already, and I reiterate so much of the stories behind it. I didn't have these, and the only reason I didn't buy, Eberhard Weber is one of my top 3 composers, musicians. I didn't really buy these only because of my job situation, so I asked for them for Christmas. Otherwise, I would jump on Eberhard Weber as soon as the thing came out, or a lot of times I used to pre-order his stuff. Here's Encore, which is, I think most people who know Eberhard Weber or like him at all know he had a stroke in 2007, and he's not been able to play bass since. And so what he's done on the last couple albums, this is his most recent album, actually, which come out in the last year. It's got a 2015 date on it, so even less than a year ago. And his prior album, called Resume, or Resume, I'm not sure, had him revisiting. In the last 12 years or so prior to his stroke, he was touring a lot as the bass player for Jan Garbrick's group, and every night touring he got to take an extended bass solo. And believe it or not, one of the sound engineers recorded all of those shows, which came in use because after his stroke, Eberhard Weber asked for tapes of a lot of these bass solos, and decided to kind of edit them, like take out the chunks that were interesting, and because most of them were improvised, if not pretty much all of them were improvised. And if there was a 15-minute solo, there might be a 5-minute chunk in there that he really liked that he decided to isolate. And then the first album he would add some synthesizer to that he would play himself. He has basically one hand that he could play with. Can't play bass with one hand so much, but he added some keyboard colors to some of these bass solos, and some of them, a lot of them, most of them really came out really well, like mini compositions. And on the prior album, he did that. Some of the bass solos stand on their own because he was looping live and playing over the loops as well. So some of them you could just listen to without any additional instrumentation to them. But he did add synthesizer later on, after his stroke, to some of these tracks, bring them to another level. And also, Michael DePasqua, one of my favorite drummers who had retired from drumming, came down on the former album Resume and played some drums on a few of the tracks, and Jan Garbarek added some saxophone on some of the tracks as well, and made a nice album. He additionally did this with Encore, the same concept. He has many bass solos, and he took some more bass solos, isolated chunks of them, and added keyboards to them. On two of the tracks, he adds sampled drums, and I don't like sampled drums for a lot of reasons. They work well in rock music. I don't think they work well in this kind of jazz or ECM jazz in general, because I always thought the drums were not about keeping a beat or establishing a groove as much as they were coloring the music and dynamically enhancing the music, like John Christensen would do, or Mike DePasqua would do. And on two tracks here, he does use kind of sampled drums because he didn't call Mike DePasqua back. And to me, that's a little, it doesn't work as well maybe on those couple tracks. I can put up with it. It's fine. They're all short tracks. There's 13 tracks on this album, ranging from 2 minutes and 5 minutes, a lot of short tracks here, to the longest one is 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So there's a lot of short tracks on here. So you tend to, and I noticed when I was listening to it, you listen to it almost like a single composition, like a classical composition, where those 2 minute pieces and those 3 minute pieces are really just sections of the larger picture. It's kind of brief for them to stand as compositions on their own. But he doesn't have Garbarek come back. He doesn't have DePasqua come back. He actually has Ak van Rooyen, a flugelhorn player, come back. I say come back is somebody that played on his very first album in '73, I think it was, The Colors of Chloe, which a lot of people love. And that was the first Eberhard Weber solo album, very influential album. Everybody seems to love that album. And he hasn't played on an Eberhard Weber album since that. They played together in United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. Ak van Rooyen was a member of that ensemble, though. So they played together, but Ak van Rooyen did not play trumpet or flugelhorn after that first Colors of Chloe album. And all the subsequent albums that Eberhard Weber came up with. So he had Ak van Rooyen come down and add new, on some of the tracks, new flugelhorn parts. Very interesting. And the odd thing is, even with the shorter tracks and with the sample drums being on a couple different tracks, which, like I said, I'm not so fond of, I actually like this album better than the prior Resume album. The flugelhorn really is nice. It really works in well. It doesn't stand out as much as the sax, like Jan Garbarek's saxophone on the prior album, kind of stood out very much, like, there's another musician there. The flugelhorn tends to blend in more with the bass and all the overdub bass things going on and the keyboards. And I actually really like this. I like this one, I think, more than the prior one. Now, Eberhard Weber said this is probably going to be his last solo album, sadly. And, which is one of the reasons why he asked van Rooyen to come down, because he wanted to, as he said, end where he began. But I hope not. He said that he's got many more bass solos recorded that he hasn't used yet in these pieces. And yet it sounds like he's not going to do another album like this, and I kind of wish he would. I really like this one. There's only a few reviews on Amazon for it, and people seem to not like it as much as the prior one, and I like it better, just from my initial couple listenings. But that's my personal taste. But I really like the flugelhorn editions in there, and the keyboard editions that Eberhard did himself. Along those same lines, another one that just came out, and I'm surprised, ECM has been very slowly. I noticed that it seems to take over a year now from the time an album's recorded on ECM till the time it finally sees the light of day. And it seems like that time frame over the years has increased. And you're getting albums that are coming out like a year and a half or more after they were recorded. Oddly enough, this one I think was recorded in a live performance, no less, in January 2015, and here it is December, and it's been out for a while already. Only disappointing thing on this homage to Eberhard Weber is that there's one more live track on here. That the album's 69 minutes. There's an additional track that they played that's a 9-minute track that it would have fit on the CD, and it's available only as a download, and it's not even available separately as a download, but you have to buy the entire album again to get that one track. That's not typically the way ECM works, and I'm very disappointed in that. And it almost seems like ECM is kind of driving people to buy the download instead of the physical album. And that's not been their philosophy. Their philosophy all along is, in the vinyl days, buy vinyl. In the CD days, CD or vinyl. They're very much into the quality of the sound experience on the physical media. And, they haven't been, they do downloads because you have to do downloads nowadays. That's how a lot of people buy their music, buy music in general. So I was surprised that they've gone that route, and I really want to hear that 9-minute track, but I don't. I'll someday I might break down or hope the additional track becomes available. What this is homage to Eberhard Weber, which actually has come out more recently and after his last solo album. Is these musicians that you can see listed here got together and decided to pay homage to Eberhard Weber and his compositions over the years. And a big band, Michael Gibbs is a very famous jazz arranger, selected a bunch of tracks and plays with the SWR big band, which is all horns. I just know, I'm looking in the list here. I thought there might be strings in there, but it's a very horn jazz oriented big band that record, with tons of music. You've probably got albums, if you're a jazz fan at all, that they appear on, because they appear on tons and tons of albums, especially with established known musicians. And it's a really good album. There's new arrangements to old Eberhard Weber tracks, including one of my very favorite tracks called Touch, which was a very short, like under 5-minute track, very, very rare at the time, from the very first Eberhard Weber's Colors album. And there's this little 5-minute track on there called Touch, which I love, just for a quartet of keyboards, saxophone, bass, and drums. And I've always loved that track. And it's arranged here in an 8-minute version, an extended version, with nice colors from the horns and the orchestra, the orchestral horns playing, by Michael. I believe Michael Gibbs did that arrangement. Very nice version of the track, and I'm glad to see it, because that's pretty much a track that came out in '75 on the Yellowfields album. So, and I don't know of it being played live very much even. Love that track. And there's a few other tracks, another 5 tracks in total, but 4 other tracks are Eberhard Weber compositions with new arrangements made for this SWR big band. And solos in there. Guest appearances by Paul McCandless from Oregon, Gary Burton, and Jan Garbrick. And there was an upright bass player on here, Scott Coley, which is a guy I didn't know anything about. Turns out he's right from New York City, who plays upright, which is real good. I'm glad when they had to have a bass player fill in for Eberhard Weber that they chose an upright bass player, because I think that's much, much closer to the Eberhard Weber sound than an electric bass player would be. Eberhard Weber was in the audience for this, so we got to see it. And the main piece on the album is 31-minute long piece. And even though it's credited to Pat Metheny, who wrote a lot of it, it's really essentially based on there's a couple video films of Eberhard Weber playing extended bass solos. The idea came about to take these films, to use the music in the films, and rearrange it any way you want, and write a composition around it using these solos that Eberhard Weber had played. Not much different than the technique that he used for the Resume album, and on the Encore album that I just showed. But in this case, there was a visual aspect to it as well. And the idea would be that they would take Eberhard Weber's bass parts and the film, rearrange them any way that Pat Metheny wanted, and Pat Metheny would write a composition around those pieces. And like I said, it's a 31-minute composition, utilizing those bass parts, and write an entire piece around them. So I'm pretty sure throughout it, it's not Eberhard Weber playing every single minute in the piece, but there's large chunks where he is playing. And the idea was that they would play the piece live, which is where this is a recording of a live concert, with the backdrop of a screen of Eberhard Weber's playing during these particular sections of the piece, and the entire big band and the band with with Gary Burton and everyone, and Danny Gottlieb, the drummer, would be playing live this composition in sync with this film of Eberhard Weber's bass solos. I think that might be too loud. That's the album playing in the background. Actually, to what extent you can hear it, I was playing the prior Encore album by Eberhard Weber, and now I'm playing this in the background. And that's Jan Garbarek on sax. It's probably the one thing you might be able to hear. So you have this 30-minute piece with the film screen backdrop in sections of where Eberhard Weber's playing, and the live band, the SWR Big Band, interacting and playing along with these pre-recorded bass solos. And then, the rest of the piece, like I said, it's not Eberhard Weber playing throughout I believe, the 31-minute piece, but he crops up from time to time. I imagine they would have filmed this, and this probably would come out on video at some point. The odd thing with that is that, there's this younger version of Eberhard Weber up on screen, playing these solos from years ago, from I believe the mid-1980s, with this newly written piece being played in conjunction with this live band. It must have been very hard to sync up, and comes off very successfully. And then the whole other band, and Gary Burton on vibraphones, and I believe even during that piece, the bass player Scott Coley is playing as well at times. Must have been a weird experience for Eberhard, because he's sitting in the audience watching these people play, and first watching him play his own compositions, and then watching him play, watching this live band playing to this visual image of Eberhard Weber's younger self playing these bass solos that they're kind of interacting with and playing along with. Must have been a very weird experience for him. And it works. So 31-minute piece is really the thing that you buy the album for, I guess. And I love the other rearrangement pieces of the other 5 pieces that are on here that are prior compositions of Eberhard's with new arrangements. Definitely worth listening to. But Pat Metheny is credited with the 31-minute track, though so much of it, when you hear it, is obviously Eberhard Weber's playing, and including in parts of the bass solos that he's playing, that they're playing along with, that the big band is playing along with, and that Metheny wrote composition to, is sometimes he's actually playing sections of compositions of his that appear in other albums. I definitely recognize bits and pieces of changes. So obviously Pat Metheny was working with these already written compositions, and I thought it's a bit weird that Eberhard Weber doesn't get at least a partial composition credit for that 31-minute piece. It all, oddly enough, goes to Pat Metheny, which is strange, because a lot of it is working with these pre-recorded chord changes and these pre-recorded recording of Eberhard Weber playing. Would this be a place to start with Eberhard Weber's music? Probably not, but there's nothing wrong with it. But there's maybe better introductions. But if you're a fan and you already know his music and you like it, you definitely love this album. I'm sure. And again, I've only played it a couple times. I think with a 31-minute piece like that, you've really got to sit, give it your full attention, try not to read emails when you're listening to it kind of thing, to really judge how successful it is. But it works for me, and if you didn't know that that this thing had been written to these pre-recorded bass solos from 20 years ago, you would never know to listen to it. It doesn't sound like it was contrived, to kind of put this thing together, but it doesn't really work. No, it works just fine. There's one thing I forgot to grab, and I don't know what I did with this. Of course. Here it is. Tangerine Dream, the first thing they did without Edgar Foressa. This is a cardboard thing. It's weird. Last Christmas, I had asked for and received also in a cardboard thing the Malacunia album by Tangerine Dream that came out I think it came out just before or right at the point that Edgar Foressa passed away. And it just dawned on me when I got this year that that I got Malacunia for Christmas of last year. It had been out for a while, so yeah, I guess it did come out. I remember Carm showing Malacunia. He bought it pretty much when it came out, and I got it months later. So it was released before Edgar's passing. And I asked for it for last Christmas, and I got it for last Christmas, and that was a much longer album. That was almost like a full-length album. Edgar came up with this concept. He calls these things cup discs, and what they was, by his definition, they're actually mini albums, kind of, and they were meant to be in the 35-minute range to 45-minute range and not exceed 45 minutes. So it's kind of the length of the old vinyl albums. But he came up with the concept of having these shorter mini albums. Like I said, he called them cup discs. And they pretty much would feature all new material or re-recordings of older material, versus a lot of the albums he was putting out were compilation albums in the last few years with just a few new pieces sprinkled in there. So these cup disc things became probably of more interest to the Tangerine Dream fan. The problem with the cup discs is that they weren't distributed here in America as much. So the idea was that these cup discs would come out at a reasonable price, but here in America we're paying more than we would for a full-length CD that was domestically released. I think when this first showed up on Amazon it was like $20. I think it's gone down by a couple dollars since then. What this is the first thing that's come out under the Tangerine Dream name since Edgar's passing that Edgar didn't actually play on. Apparently he was involved in the concept of some of the pieces. And it's interesting because obviously here's the first thing that Edgar doesn't play on that's under the Tangerine Dream name, and it's three of the musicians that were in the last version of Tangerine Dream. And I thought this was initially just a cup disc on its own, but apparently it's almost like a teaser for an upcoming album. I'm a little disappointed by a couple things. The length of it is only about 31 minutes. It's very short. Here in America, it's costing $18, $19, $20. And the reason is that these are all imports coming from, I guess, actually coming from Edgar's own label, now run by his wife, I guess. And since they're not getting released domestically for the most part, it's essentially an import, so you're paying money. So the whole concept of the cup discs being cheaper than full-length albums doesn't really work here in America. But I was just dying to hear it. And the reason I was dying to hear it is because I like the last edition of the band, and I've never figured out how to pronounce his name, but I'm going to try. The Thorsten Quaesching. Never knew how to pronounce his name. I've seen it in writing for 10 years now. Is a keyboard player that Edgar brought in a number of years ago. He's younger than me. And he, to me, is the best addition to Tangerine Dream pretty much since the beginning. I'm fairly tough on the members that have come into the band since the classic lineup of Chris Frank and Peter Baumann split up. I haven't really cared for most of the members he brought in. The one exception, people seem to really like in the early 80s, Johannes Smalling, which I didn't like I wasn't a fan of what he brought into Tangerine Dream. I haven't bought any solo discs by him, and I would. And it may have been more Edgar. Edgar wanted to change direction. But I wasn't a fan of Johannes Smalling's work in Tangerine Dream. It wasn't bad, it's just that the direction started to change, and I didn't like it as much. Everybody loved him. The one guy that I really liked that they brought in much later on, there's been a million people in and out of the group, was Paul Haslinger, who was a really, really young guy, who came in the late 80s, only stayed for a few years, stayed long enough to work with Chris Frank before Chris Frank left the band. When Chris Frank left the band, for a while, Tangerine Dream was just Edgar Froese and Paul Haslinger. And again, the only bad things I think really about the albums that Paul Haslinger was on, I attribute really to Edgar Froese's desire to change the music of Tangerine Dream and not Paul Haslinger's contribution, because in the end I really loved Paul Haslinger's contribution to the group. And he ended up leaving for a couple of reasons. One of them was he did want to come to America, I believe, which is where he is, and live here and work here primarily on soundtrack work if he could get it, which is exactly pretty much why Chris Frank left too. The band was at that time still based, I guess, in Berlin, though not so much in recent years. But Edgar's never been a guy to live in America. So and the other musicians that came after that, I wasn't crazy about it. I didn't think they should bring in guitarists. The band became too guitar-oriented, I thought. I didn't mind the idea of saxophone in the band. I thought it was nice to have an acoustic presence, but a lot of it didn't work for me. And I bought a whole bunch of the albums. But I really, but this guy, Thorsten, when he came in, Jesus, and he wrote a bunch of compositions, completely solo, of his are on Tangerine Dream albums, and there's a time that shortly before Edgar passed, some of the Tangerine Dream albums would be split up amongst compositions that were entirely written and played by Edgar Froese, and other tracks that were totally and completely written and played by Thorsten. And I love those tracks better than Edgar's tracks. I thought they had more development to them. And so I'm a Thorsten fan, no doubt about it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in hearing the group post-Edgar, really. There's a person that I wasn't familiar with, but a lot of people have heard, that came in very late, just before Edgar's passing, another keyboard player, Ulrich Schnaus, which I believe is how you pronounce it, who's had solo albums out. I haven't heard of solo albums, but a lot of people have, and thought that he's an excellent addition. He did appear on Malacunia, I'm pretty sure, yeah. But I haven't been able to quite figure out what Ulrich Schnaus's contribution is as much, but I certainly like the music, there's no doubt about it. So it's definitely a thumbs up. I don't know, I can't really pick out what came from Thorsten, say, and what came from Ulrich, but really that's a great combination, I thought. And there's a violin player that came into the group that was listed as being on the previous Malacunia, but I don't recall really hearing much violin at all. And a female named Hashiko Yamane, and she's on this new disc too. It's really just the three of them, and you actually hear violin here. And I know she probably played more on the live albums. I haven't purchased the live albums of the recent vintage of their tours, the last tours that they did with Edgar, that she does play violin on. Like I said, I wasn't picking up everything that they came out with. It's almost hard to, and I'm not as much a fan of live albums. And I may go back, but I really wanted to hear her violin playing in the context of a studio album. And even though the songs aren't really based around the violin, most of these 4 tracks that are on here, she gets a violin solo in. And it seems to me to work better than the saxophone. And I thought saxophone would work really well in Tangerine Dream. But I think you have to find the right player for it, too. The violin works really well in these compositions. And oddly enough, 3 out of the 4 compositions also has a writing credit for Edgar on there. I don't know how much Edgar had to do really with writing, whether it was more conceptual ideas or whether he had some chord changes that these guys then went and did their thing on top of. But it's really good. It still kind of sounds like Edgar's in the group. And one of the things I liked so much about Thorsten's contribution was it actually sounded very different than pretty much all of the Tangerine Dream music in the last 20 years, in a subtle way. This album, which I expected to sound more like a Thorsten album, actually sounds a lot like... It does sound a lot like a really good Edgar Fruesa thing. Like I said, it's only 31 minutes. I don't know if you would buy... here's the thing. There's 4 tracks on here. One of them, which is a 9-minute track called Genesis of Precious Thoughts, is taken from their upcoming album called Quantum Gate. So basically what that leaves is 3 compositions that look like they're not going to be on the coming album. And that leaves about 22, 23 minutes... I guess about 22 minutes of material that you might not be able to get anywhere else, because obviously the very first track on here is going to be on their upcoming album. So it depends on how hardcore of a fan you are. Do you really, can you get this at a reasonable price? Are you a hardcore fan enough to, want to buy it for 3 tracks and about 21 minutes of new material that may not appear on another album? Had I known that, would I have waited? I don't know. I was really dying to hear the band without Edgar. And I'm such a Thorsten... If I wasn't a fan of Thorsten, I probably would have waited until the next full-length album came out. But I do really like it. I like it as much as the recent stuff that I've heard that Thorsten's on, which I'm a fan of. Like I said, I'm not sure what Ulrich Schnaus, who gets composing credits on these. Let's see. 3 of the tracks are credited to Edgar Fruesa, Thorsten, and Ulrich Schnaus, and one of the tracks is just credited to Thorsten and Ulrich Schnaus. And the violinist doesn't get composition credits, even though she does play on solos on them. So it doesn't seem like she's composing for the band as much as she is a featured soloist in the band. Works for me, Edgar was recording a lot of material over, the last 5 or 10 years. It just never seemed to stop. So I don't think there was a lot of time spent on a lot of compositions. A lot of samey things started sounding the same to me. When Thorsten came into the band, I really thought, oh wow, it's the first guy since Paul Hasslinger that I can really hang my hat on. And I'm a fan of the Zeit period of Tangerine Dream, even before Chris Frank and Peter Baumann kind of established the 3-man classic lineup of the group. So, it's went much longer than I planned. One other thing I got, and I'll talk about it in a future one because it went on for too long. Wayne Shorter box set of reissue of 4 albums that have been out of print of his, 3 of them from the 80s, from the mid-80s, after the breakup of Weather Report, pretty much. One from the 70s, and then 2 discs which feature Wayne's solo compositions for Weather Report throughout their history. Is about 2 hours of that, and for a good price. I've listened to all of these, but I've gone on for over an hour, so I'll talk about that, I guess, in an upcoming video. And on a personal note, I want to thank Carm for his videos. By the way, he's done a couple of videos recently, and I know he did them just because he knew I wanted to see them. So thanks for that, Carm. I have finally have mixed feelings about this. I have found employment, kind of. Starting Monday, I have a new job, and I have to be honest, it's the first time that I will have a job where I'm not working in an office for over 30 or 40 years. And it's basically because I need to earn an income. It's not a great job. I'm not going to really mention so much what it is. But it is going to take up a lot of my time, and I'm definitely not going to stop making videos, and it may just take me longer to see other people's videos and to comment. And when I do videos, it's probably going to be the thing that forces me to do shorter videos, because I won't have the time at home to listen so much to music for a while. Right now, it looks like for the first couple of weeks I have to go what they call training. And unfortunately, the training is so far away that I'm going to be in the car 3 to 4 hours a day just getting to and from training. And that's going to be for a couple weeks. I fully intend on being online and, making a video. I don't even know when I'm going to have off, because I'll probably be working weekends. Maybe I won't be working weekends during training. That I'm not sure of. So, it may take me a little longer to see all the folks' videos that, when I see that they're out there and somebody's recording, I pretty much jump on them right away. It's a big, exciting thing for me. And a big deal, since I've really become part of the community, since I've become unemployed. I really just jumped on here in the last year. And of course, just before I lost my job, but at that point I was working diminishing hours anyway. So now for the next couple weeks, and I don't know what the future holds. But I'll still be watching everybody's videos. I'll still be recording my own, but I don't know. For a couple weeks, it's going to be a little hinky, And I have mixed feelings about it. Great, I'll be earning a living. Still, I think I'll be without benefits for quite some time. But right now, I need a place to live. So, I need to pay the bills, So, the jobs aren't out there like they used to be. What can I tell you? And honestly, I've looked, but I haven't even seen a single office job that I was qualified for in all this time. So I kind of knew I would have to take a different route. And a lot of people are in that boat, I'm sure. Okay, guys, so that's it for now. Today's the 30th. I may or may not post something. I probably won't post it. I don't know, whatever. Whenever you see this, I hope if you see it before New Year's, I hope you have a great New Year's Eve and a safe one. If you see it after New Year's, Happy New Year. Thanks again to Carm for his last couple of videos, which I know were definitely tailor-made for me. And I'll be back real soon. I'm definitely going to be back before I go off to the training on Monday and record something or other. And so Happy New Year to everyone out there, and I'll be back soon. Take care.